Joining us now on the line from Washington, D.C., Asa Hutchinson. He is a former member of Congress from Arkansas, former head of the Drug Enforcement Agency in the U.S., now a senior partner at the Asa Hutchinson Law Group. And we're glad you could join us on the line from the American Capitol. How are you tonight?
I'm doing terrific and glad to be with you.
Thanks for making time for us. You were, I actually want to start with one of the mentions on your resume that I didn't just say, and that is you were appointed a U.S. attorney during Ronald Reagan's time, and that marked, I guess, the beginning of the get tough on crime approach. So let's start with just a little bit of background. How did the tough on crime policies gain such traction all those years ago?
Well, because they had a serious problem. When you look at the late 70s and early 80s, you had Miami Vice, you had cocaine flowing almost without constraint through South Florida in the United States. Cocaine, all drug use was at an all-time high. Actually, since then, cocaine use in the United States has dropped dramatically, and overall drug use has gone down about 50% since that time of intensity during the Reagan administration in the early 80s.
So can we say that that policy worked?
Well, I think you certainly can say it worked. I would say that it worked because of the reduction in drug use by our teens today. It's still a problem, but it had a very effective result in reduced use. Obviously, we've seen some problems with it as well that you have to correct, and we're still correcting some of those. But leadership makes a difference whenever you're talking about fighting illegal drugs, and it did in that case.
So you referred to some problems that came up as a result of the tough on crime approach, such as what?
Well, many of the things that we impacted there, for example, mandatory minimums, we recognized after decades that there was some unfairness in that and we needed to give judges a little bit more discretion. We didn't do away with the mandatory minimum penalties, but we gave an escape valve capability to the judge whenever the judge said this would really create an injustice. Manifest injustice, they could deviate from that mandatory minimum. And so that was one lesson that was learned. Whenever you look at little things like, we became punitive in saying that if someone had a prior drug use or drug conviction, they could not qualify for government loan to go to school. Well, we realized that created some unfairness. Whenever you look at, we became very punitive in people coming into our country if they have a drug conviction in their home country, and that is still the law today. But these kind of consequences, I don't think help us overall, but have some negative impact that probably needs to be corrected still.
So that has led these decades later to something that I gather many in the United States are now calling not necessarily the tough on crime approach, but the right on crime approach. What's that mean?
Well, it's a play on words somewhat because, one, we have to get it right. This is such an important area when you're talking about criminal justice, people's lives, society values. We need to get it right, and also because of the cost of it. But secondly, it's a message to conservatives. I'm certainly from the conservative standpoint in the United States. I've been a federal prosecutor, head of the DEA, probably as tough as they come in terms of drug prosecutions particularly, but I also recognize that conservatives, it's fair to say we ought to get it right, we ought to take a new look at this. It's very expensive, and it's all right to conservatives to reconsider some of these policies to make sure we're doing it the right way.
But the suggestion, if I'm inferring too much here, you tell me, but it sounds like the suggestion is conservatives, there's an angle to being conservative on crime that is a bit doctrinaire, and your critics would probably even say mindless, whereas this offers the opportunity for conservatives, it's suggested, to be both tough on crime but smarter on crime. Does that about cover it?
No, absolutely right, because traditionally, if you're in the conservative camp, if there's a tough crime provision comes up, you have to instinctively support it. And it's very difficult to say, well, maybe that's not the right approach. Your conservative credentials are questioned. And so we're sending a signal in the Right on Crime initiative that you can be tough on crime, you can be supportive of law enforcement, but you can also say we want to be fair and just and also look out after the taxpayers' dollars. And so for Texas, for example, where much of this initiative started, they had an opportunity to build bigger prisons because they knew they're going to have to incarcerate more people because of the existing tough laws. And they said there's another approach we can take, which is to build better reentry programs, some alternatives to prison. And they did that. The crime rate went down. They saved hundreds of millions of dollars for taxpayers' money. And in this tight budget time in the United States, let me assure you, the state legislators particularly are trying to look at ways to save prison dollars and yet not at the same time not compromise public safety.
Is that a tacit acknowledgement in the United States that, you know, that you folks are putting too many people in jail?
You have to be careful there because you could argue that, certainly that point that it's not a matter of whether we're putting too many people in jail. The bigger question is, are we putting the right people in jail? And so, for example, if we found somebody that was charged with burglary or some nonviolent crime, but they had an addiction problem, it was a drug addiction problem, they're not the right people to put in jail. If they're willing to go into treatment with accountability and get back as a productive member, that is a better solution. And so it's not about too many, but it was about the right people. And of course, whenever you talk about it in that context, in fact, it did reduce some prison population because of that new approach and that reevaluation.
Well, in which case, if we don't want to measure how well the U.S. justice system is doing by, say, the number of convictions that prosecutors get or the number of people who are incarcerated, what's a better way to measure how effective the criminal justice system is working?
Well, I think, first of all, by the recidivism rate, how many people that are being released from prison actually go back into a life of crime, and that deals with the reentry programs and how successful they are. It deals with, I think you have to measure it by in drug cases, you know, whether drug use is going down, crime rates are going down. That has to be a measure of the effectiveness. And then you need to measure it from a public safety standpoint. Are people we're releasing from prison going about and committing violent crimes again, which is, again, the recidivism issue, but it's directed toward the violent issue. We have to be very, very careful that we have the right rules in place, reentry programs in place, that we screen people, that we're not releasing back into society those that will pose a continued risk. Those are some of the measuring qualities that I think are important.
Okay. One of the reasons we were most anxious to have you on the program is because you actually came up here. You testified before a House of Commons Public Safety Committee because we are, as you know, going through a big debate in this country right now thanks to the relatively new conservative government's attempts to change how we handle crime in this country. And one of the things you told our House of Commons committee was that you hoped that we could avoid in Canada many of the mistakes that you had made in the United States. For example, what were you thinking there?
Well, one, I was delighted to respond to the invitation from the Canadian Parliament to testify, and I tried not to be presumptuous because I would not try as an American to tell Canada what they need to do. They can make good judgments there. But I did want to give them the benefit of the American experience. And one of the things that I referred to is a lot of questions on mandatory minimum sentences that I know are being considered in Canada. The danger is that you know, we have mandatory minimum penalties of 10 years and 5 years for possession of a gun during the commission of a violent crime. It's a mandatory penalty. But we also had mandatory minimum penalties of 5 and 10 years for certain drug offenses. And what we found is that because of the conspiracy laws, you would have some almost bystander that would technically get caught up because they're in the wrong place, but they would be found guilty, and the judge has to sentence them to the mandatory minimum. So one lesson we learned is that the judge, to accomplish justice, has to have some discretion, that they can override a mandatory minimum penalty whenever it really is obviously unfair and would produce an unfair and unjust result. So that's one lesson that we learned that I think is important. And then secondly, I think that we did learn that while you have to be tough on the drug traffickers, those that are engaging in bringing massive amounts of drugs into our country, we have to really provide an alternative to those that have an addiction problem that are in the user category and small possession amounts. And that's where we save dollars in terms of not incarcerating all of those, but giving alternatives to prison, such as treatment programs with accountability. So those are really two main points that I offered in terms of what we have learned here in the United States.
So you gave that advice, and what was your sense about how eager or not the Canadian government was to take that advice?
Well, politics gets involved there.
You don't say.
Depends on which side of the political offense that you're speaking to. But you know, in one sense, you know, the conservatives obviously want to bring Canadian laws more effective in fighting crime. And I mean, from a United States perspective, you know, and former DEA head, it always has appeared to me that Canada has been soft on the drug side. So toughening up doesn't bother me any. So you've got that part of the message. But at the same time, I understand when you talk about mandatory minimums, even though there might be much smaller than what we have in the United States, you can still have some injustices if there's not some discretion for the unfair cases or the bystander getting caught up. And many times it's like a girlfriend that happens to be with her guy who's doing a drug transaction. She happens to be there. She has no intent, but she's in the wrong place, the wrong time, enough for a jury to convict, but it's not the right thing to give her a mandatory minimum of 5 years or 10 years or whatever they might be considering in Canada.
Let's go even further on this, and I'd be interested, given your background, what your view would be towards decriminalizing the possession of, you know, relatively small amounts of, let's say, marijuana, which are clearly intended for personal use as opposed to trafficking, that kind of thing. What's your view on that?
Well, my view is, one, what do you consider marijuana to be? Do you consider it a harmful drug? If you consider it a harmful drug, let's take steps to minimize its usage, not to increase it. And the real message as to whether this is legal or illegal has enormous consequences to the perception of young people. So I believe that you should continue to say the use of harmful drugs such as marijuana or some other is illegal. And you can minimize the punishment and the consequences and try to be fair about that or minimal about that and realistic about it. But let's don't decriminalize in the sense that we say it is of minimal consequence. It's like a traffic ticket. It ought to be more than just a traffic ticket if you're using an illegal and harmful drug.
The thing about that argument is, and when I talk to teenagers about this myself, they always say, yeah, but alcohol is worse for you, and they see the carnage in terms of drunk driving, that kind of thing, frequently in their newspapers or online about what alcohol abuse does. Is it harder for us in the older generation to make the case that marijuana is still considered or ought to be considered a harmful drug when what they see is alcohol being worse for you and wreaking more havoc?
Well, I mean, I think they have a very honest debate about that. Obviously, alcohol addiction is a problem in our society as well. And so do we help that situation any by saying, well, let's put another harmful drug out there that can be abused even more because we're legalizing it? That's a societal debate. I know Canada's going to make their decision. In California, we've got a decriminalization, actually a legalization initiative on the ballot there. I hope it's defeated. I hope that we maintain some consistency in saying that is illegal. But, you know, our legislators will decide and the public will decide, and we'll go on. But that's my view.
Okay, let's do one last thing here in our last minute, and that is you've told us some of the pitfalls that America has been through that we ought to avoid. Tell us one thing that you think you've done really well that we ought to copy.
Well, I think that what we've done well is to send a strong signal back in the 70s and 80s, and it's been fairly consistent that we want to, as a nation, to reduce illegal drug use, and we are not going to compromise on that, and I think you've seen drug use go down because of that. That's what I think we've done right. I think, again, what I've said is that we've made some error on the margins, but overall, being tough on illegal drugs, tough on crime is not a problem. You just have to be reasonable and fair about it, and to be honest and say, let's continue to look at this and make sure we can get it right. So that's the primary message that we're having on our Right on Crime initiative, and I hope that we can be an example. And we're not perfect. We've made a lot of mistakes in this, but we're trying to correct them as we go along.
Understood. Asa Hutchinson, it's awful good of you to join us on the line from Washington, D.C. Thanks so much for your time tonight.
It's terrific to be with you. Thank you.